Hey all, so if you recall our last video, we went over unit rates. So in this video we're gonna move on and look at proportions, which proportions is yet another way of comparing two different quantities. So a proportion is essentially two equal ratios that have different numbers in them. So an example is, if you recall, a couple days ago we did equivalent ratios. So we went over how the ratio 6 to 2 and 3 to 1 are equivalent ratios, right? So proportions are just writing these ratios instead as fractions. So we would have like 6 over 2 is equal to 3 over 1. Another example of proportions would be 10 over 4 and 5 over 2. So those are what proportions are. And this can be useful to us in, say, scale drawings. So suppose we have a map, and a map represents just a scaled down version of the real landscape. So in the real landscape, it might be 60 miles between Mount Pleasant and Provo, but on a map, that distance might just be a couple inches. But those inches are scaled so that the proportions are the same. And we would have the two equivalent ratios. So let's go through a couple of examples. So one of the ways that we're going to use these is to solve algebraic equations that use proportions. So now we're going to bring in some of the algebra that we worked on in the last unit. So suppose we have 5 over 6 is equal to x over 30. So in order to solve these proportions, we're going to use algebraic trick, which is called cross-multiplying. So in cross-multiplying, when you have two fractions or proportions equal to each other, we can multiply the numerator of one fraction by the denominator of the other. So we're going to do 5 times 30. And we know that that has to be equal to 6, which is the denominator of this one, times the numerator of the other one. So 6 times x. So if we multiply 5 by 30, we're going to get 150 is equal to 6 times x. And now we have a basic one-step division equation. So if you recall, to solve this one, we're going to divide both sides by x. And if we divide 150 by 6, we're going to get, let's see, 25. So we're going to get that x is equal to 25, which we got using cross multiplication. So that is one method of solving equivalent proportions. Another method to figure out what x would have been to say, okay, instead of, I'm going to write down the equation again, 5 over 6 is equal to x over 30. So instead of cross multiplying, we could have said, okay, what do I have to multiply 6 by to get 30? And the answer would be 5, right? If I multiply the bottom by 5, then that means I also have to multiply the top by 5. And 5 times 5 is equal to 25, so that means that 25 has to be equal to x. And this is more similar to what we were doing when we were looking at equivalent ratios and reducing ratios. So both of these two methods will give you the same answer. We can either use kind of equivalent ratios, or we can use algebra. So let's do one more example. So let's do 6 over 12 is equal to x over 18. So here we're actually going to bring in one more step. So if we want to, we can cross multiply right away. So we can multiply the 6 by 18 and the 12 by x. But those numbers are pretty big. So let's see if there's something we can do about that. So what I notice is, hey, 6 over 12, we can reduce that, right? We're going back to what we did earlier this year on reducing fractions. We can divide both of those by 6 to reduce the fraction to 1/2. So 6 over 12 is the same as 1/2. And then we can rewrite our proportion with 1/12 and 1 over 2 instead of 6 over 12. So all I did here was I reduced this fraction. So I'll write that down. So this is not a necessary step, but it's going to make our life a lot easier if we're using the cross-multiplying method. So now we can cross-multiply, and all I have to do is 1 times 18, which is just 18, right? 18 times 1 is equal to 2 times x. So we're going to get 18 is equal to 2x. And then it's a one-step division equation. Divide by 2. And we get that x is equal to 9. Similarly, if we use the second method, we see that, okay, 6, we get 1/2 is equal to x over 18. And we say, okay, 2 to get 18, I'm going to need to multiply that by 9, right? So 1 I have to multiply by the same thing, and then I'd once again just get x is equal to 9. So that will conclude our lesson on proportions. In our next lesson, we're going to look at applying what we learned about proportions today to real-world problems. So stay tuned for that.